we can still grow and still use or still use oil or these exhaustible resources is if we offset that, right? So if our natural capital includes renewable resources, exhaustible resources, and the environment. So if we're going to use our exhaustible resources, what do we have to do? You have to make sure you have more renewables, more of the environmental quality that you have. So you have to have those trade-offs. So if we use oil, we have to then increase the capacity to use solar to offset that. So the natural capital stock is not diminishing. We're just reallocating within exhaustible, renewable, and environmental. Okay? Now, for weak sustainability, it's less restrictive. It says human capital, physical capital, and natural capital next year have to be at least as big as what we have this year. So you can see that this is much less restrictive. So what this is saying is we could take and deplete some natural capital, but improve our human capital. Okay? Historically, that's what we've been doing. The generation today is smarter than the generation two generations ago, 3 generations ago. So we have an improved human capital resources, but our natural capital stock has been depleted. Okay? So this allows for the idea that we're just not going to deplete the total capital stock instead of the natural capital stock only. So you can see it's much less restrictive. So this concept, weak sustainability, treats these 3 categories as substitutes. If you have less of one, you can have more of the other, as opposed to they're all complements, so you lose some of one, you're going to lose production. Okay? So it's a very different implication for developers. Now, when we look at this, and we look at the idea of how to implement sustainability, we have what's called the Hartwick rule. And Hartwick basically says, if you're going to use these exhaustible resources, then take the profits you make, and that's what's meant by the rents in here. Resource rents are the profits from using these resources. Take that and invest in something else, right? So if you look at, go back to Saudi Arabia again, if they take their rents from being able to sell their oil and invest it in universities, improves the human capital. They invested in infrastructure for high-tech industries. That investment will lead to improved physical capital, right? So they're taking the money that they're currently making because on this exhaustible resource and using it to improve their other forms of capital. You can look at Chile as a great example. Their GDP was 30-40% dependent upon copper exports for 100 years, right? Now they've diversified. They've taken that money they've earned from copper and invested in education, invested in infrastructure, invested in their agricultural sector. Everybody drinks Chilean wine and eats Chilean grapes and all of this. So they've invested to diversify their economy, so they're not relying as much on an exhaustible resource. Those copper deposits will be gone. So that's what Hartwick is saying. If you want to have sustainable development and use your exhaustible resources, then invest them in something that will pay off in the future to diversify. All right, so when we look at strong versus weak, we want to know what aspects of natural capital we sustain. Do we sustain the physical quantities of the resources? So if the Saudis say we have 26 million barrels of oil reserves left. Are they trying to sustain 26 billion barrels of oil? So you have a physical measure there. Or do we sustain the flow of services that the resources provide? Right? So it's a very different concept. If you're sustaining the flow of resources, then you're sustaining what that stock of oil has got get you in your economy or in your society. You can think about it at the personal level. What you're trying to sustain is your ability to get from point A to point B. So if you have to give up an internal combustion engine to do it and use an electric engine, you still can get from A to B. You've sustained that, but you have not sustained the quantity of gasoline that you have. Right? So economists are looking at more this flow of services. And you can think about it from an ecological perspective. Why do we want to preserve wetlands? We don't want to preserve wetlands because we need 1,000 acres of wetlands for mosquito breeding. We want 1,000 acres of wetlands because of the services it provides to clean water, to dampen hurricane storms, etc. So, decision-making and knowledge. What do we do when we don't have certainty? Everything that we've talked about assumes we know everything with certainty. Well, there are different kinds of uncertainty. With risk, we know what the outcomes are, and we know the probabilities that can be seen. So you can think about it in your statistics class. You have different outcomes, and you have a probability distribution with those outcomes. That's what this is saying. All right? It's a risky situation because you don't know which outcome is going to occur, but you know that A will happen with probability 0.2, B will happen with probability 0.4, something like that. That's a risky situation. Ambiguity is when the probabilities are known, but the outcomes are not exact. And you can think of climate change, right? We're talking about doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere. Will it lead to a 2-degree change, or will it lead to a 2.3-degree change? All right? So you've got some ambiguity in the outcome, but you know that a doubling is going to get you a temperature change. Then you can also have what's called uncertainty. Outcomes are known, but not the probabilities. So you know the temperature is going to increase, but you don't know what the probability is that it will happen in 50 years, or what the probability is it will happen in 70 years. And then you just have ignorance. Those are the climate. You don't know the outcomes and you don't know the probabilities. To quote Donald Rumsfeld, anybody know Donald Rumsfeld? I know what I know what I don't know, but I don't know what I don't know is the problem. So that's when you're operating in ignorance. And this doesn't mean you're not smart. Ignorance just means we don't know what's going to happen and we don't know the probability of what we don't know. So when you have those situations, basically the question becomes, how do we make a decision with imperfect knowledge? All right? So the basic question becomes, how much insurance do you buy? So if you know the temperature is going to change, how much should we spend today to try and delay that from occurring? Are you willing to allocate $1 billion of our national budget? Are we willing to use low sulfur or use low carbon fuel so that we can delay this doubling date? So that's what is meant by buying insurance. We're going to take some action now, even though we don't know for certainty what's going to come. You've talked about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change.